So let us start with the core concepts and the key concepts in bargaining theory. Now, bargaining theory as a field of study, as an approach to understanding bargaining, is based on the rational choice or game theory paradigm. Bargaining is understood as a situation in which two or more players have a common interest to cooperate, but have conflicting interests over how exactly to cooperate. So they are negotiating, they are bargaining over the distribution of the gains from cooperation. And so they are bargaining over the distribution of certain value. And if you go back to the most famous definitions of politics by Harold Lassfeld and David Easton from 30s and 50s respectively, they both talk about bargaining. Lassfeld says that politics is about who gets what, when and how. Lassfeld says that politics is a system of authoritative allocation of value across members of a society. So you see that even in these classical definitions, bargaining is pertinent to all politics, basically. So bargaining is a situation in which we have two or more actors who are negotiating over distribution of gains. These negotiations, they may or may not have certain rules that would structure the negotiation process. Rules that, for instance, would define whether the actors act simultaneously or whether they take turns, whether there are time horizons or time limits on the bargaining process, and so on and so forth. Now, the key component of any bargaining situation, as is probably clear by now, is the actors. And in bargaining theory, actors are assumed to somehow rationally, purposefully act so as to maximize the attainment of their preferences. Now, actors can be individual human beings, or they can be composite actors, for instance, organizations, states. And these organizations or states, these composite actors obviously consist of multiple individuals, multiple individual human beings. The key to understanding bargaining in bargaining theory, in the setup that we are discussing here, is that all these actors are trying to make sure that the outcome of the bargaining exercise is as close to their ideal point as possible, or to their most preferred outcome. So what are the key features of bargaining? We said already that the key element of any bargaining situation is the actors with their preferences. We already mentioned rules that may or may not structure the exercise or the interaction in some way. There are two more critical factors that we need to consider when we are trying to understand any bargaining situation. One factor or one phenomenon is the notion or the phenomenon of agreement. So whatever the final outcome of the bargaining, of the negotiations, if successful, is its content, its form, and most importantly, its distributive consequences. Now, the next or the last point that we need to consider, and this is perhaps somewhat less intuitive, is the notion of the so-called reversion point, which is the outcome that happens, that occurs when no agreement is reached. So when the negotiations actually fail. And we are, of course, most interested in the content of such an outcome. So what does it substantively mean in its form and in its distributive consequences? Again, who gets what when, or who ends up with what when the negotiations actually fail? A reversion point is also known as the conflict point, or a reservation point, actually, also in bargaining theory. And again, this point gives each of the actors certain utility. And the interaction between these components, the actors with their preferences, the rules, the possible outcomes of the bargaining, and the reversion point, so what happens when no agreement is reached. These are the things that really are at the core of our analysis of bargaining situations using the bargaining theory approach. Now, this is a very generic framework. Perfectly generic, it can apply to basically any situation, from the highest level negotiations on, let's say, nuclear disarmament, to family disputes over where to go to for holiday, right? So this is a super generic approach. Now, we are specifically interested here in crisis bargaining, of course, and I would like to say that there are two things that make crisis bargaining very distinct from other types of bargaining, or even from other types of specifically political bargaining. The first component is the large difference in actors' utility in between having an agreement and having no agreement. So the notion of crisis bargaining entails the idea that ending up with no agreement, with a failure to reach an agreement, will hurt everyone. The second component of crisis, or the second element of the crisis bargaining situation, is that the reversion point, the point of no agreement, is dynamically worsening over time. So the notion of crisis means that if nothing happens, that things are getting worse and worse by their own dynamic, right? Things do not stay the same for a long time. So this is really kind of the basic setup of the bargaining theory approach to crisis negotiations or crisis bargaining. As I mentioned, it's a rational choice or game theory based approach to understanding bargaining. Of course, there are other approaches. Some approaches would say that actors, human beings, are actually not at all that rational, and that we observe various psychological biases in their behavior, for instance. Other approaches would focus on the identities of the actors, and they would claim that the identities are actually a critical component or critical determinant of the behavior of the actors, rather than their specific interests pertinent to the issue at stake, that their identities and the norms that guide their behavior are the more important determinants of the outcomes. Right? And yet other approaches would say that actors are not important at all, that outcomes in international politics and in international crises are anyway determined by kind of structural historical forces that determine everything. And so there are different takes on bargaining situations. I specifically discuss here in this segment of the class this notion of bargaining based on these game theoretical approaches to bargaining. As I mentioned before, my colleagues will add to that after this introductory session.